And I'm now going to give the floor to Nadia MAIZI, Director of the TTI.5 Institute and co-author of the 5th report from the IPCC. She will open the day. Thank you.
Merci Sébastien, merci Oriane.
Thank you, Sébastien. Thank you, Oriane.
Bonjour à tous.
Hello, everyone.
Je suis vraiment ravie de
I'm really happy
d'introduire en fait ce
to
deuxième
introduce
forum et ravie
the second forum.
d'avoir pu rassembler dans ce
I'm
programme
delighted
des intervenants prestigieux qui pour
to
beaucoup
have
sont
those
venus
prestigious
de loin,
speakers.
sont venus d'Afrique
For
en
many, they're
particulier,
coming from very
et,
far,
qui vont nous
specifically
permettre,
from Africa.
d'avoir une perspective
And they are
qui,
going
je
to
pense,
give
très
us
différente
an outlook that is quite different, I believe, from what we usually know, see, or understand from the climate issues in the African continent. This morning, I will give an introduction where I will try and motivate you on the lessons we can learn and the inspiration we can draw from the situation in Africa around climate issues. Then we'll have a session dedicated to mitigation with speakers from South Africa, Algeria, a speaker who couldn't come, unfortunately, from Oxfam. They didn't get their visa, to be fully honest, unfortunately. And we will also have a speaker from Burkina Faso. And then we will conclude the session with a short film with, up until the meal, the lunch. We also have a colleague from the 6th report of the IPCC. She's now vice president of Group 1 for the 7th report. She will make a first presentation, then we'll take stock on specific techniques dedicated to mitigation with a speaker from Burkina Faso, and also the challenges around critical materials, presented by a researcher who also comes from Burkina Faso. Then we will have a session on funding and negotiations. This will be part of the two presentations we'll get. First, a presentation from the OECD, who will speak about a program around the climate and people for the planet. I don't really remember the acronym, I'm sorry. And finally, we'll have a roundtable on negotiation-related issues with a presentation from our colleague from the IPCC and a researcher who takes part in the COPs with us. In order to conclude the day, we will have a discussion on two research programs dedicated to Africa. This will be part of a second roundtable, and the agenda is so packed that we decided to use WooClap for exchanges, but we also have breaks, and you will get a chance to extend those discussions. So my presentation now, I'm going to use this microphone. African perspectives. I wanted to start by giving you a cold picture of Africa as perceived by the IPCC. I was part of the 3rd working group on mitigation, and I'm going to give you a few figures to present the continent. Africa, and this might not be said enough, with regards to greenhouse gases, out of the global total in 2019, that's 9% of global greenhouse gases.
Il y a une progression qui se fait de manière beaucoup
There
plus
is
modérée
an increase that is much more moderate
région.
than in other
Et
regions.
ici, dans ce graphe, ce que vous voyez, c'est
In this
la
graph,
proportion, en fait, de législation qu'il va y avoir autour du climat dans les différentes
the
régions.
share
Donc, nous, on
of
s'intéresse
legislation
à l'Afrique et on
around
voit,
climate in the
que
different
le
regions.
carré bleu foncé
For Africa,
est en
you can see
train
the dark blue
d'apparaître,
part that
mais
is emerging.
que finalement, ces législations
But in the
sont,
end,
vraiment dans leur balbutiement.
This is just the
Il y a
beginning.
aussi toute une discussion qui se fait sur l'Afrique.
There are also discussions happening on Africa in terms of historical responsibility. This is why it's interesting to look at the cumulated budget of emissions, this graph right here,
C'est ce graphe qui est ici en bas. Donc je vous ai mis des
at the
flèches
bottom
pour
of the
regarder
screen.
là où il faut. Et donc, on voit que le budget cumulé pour l'Afrique.
Here you can see the cumulated budget for Africa broken down per CO2 emissions from fossil fuels and from land use. The cumulated budget is 7%. And if you look at the graph on the right corner, you can see that the greenhouse gases emissions per capita is way below developed countries. In the IPCC report, there are some generic results and also per chapter. And I thought it would be interesting to extract the details of the carbon footprint per capita. The red squares give an average per country, and this is ranked per GDP growth. In this graph, we see quite a weak footprint in comparison with the global ranking. You can see that the African countries are at the bottom, and there's a big difference with the most developed countries on the top of the graph, which relates to a result from a decision maker's report assessing that 10% of the global wealthiest contribute to about half of the greenhouse gases emissions on the planet. And in African countries, there are rich people as well, and we can see this with the different points that I showed you earlier. So where do those greenhouse gases emissions come from in Africa? Well, for most of them, the largest part comes from what we call land use and soil usage-related emissions. For those specific emissions, the weight of Africa is 20%, so that's quite significant, and this comes specifically from usage of the forest. Last week, there was a big meeting in Paris to discuss the possibility of changing the resources used for cooking, which uses a lot of coal. There's also usage for agriculture, also methane emissions due to cattle breeding, and you can find the disaggregated data in the graph. Finally, final graph, to present the context, is about emission reduction potentials and related elements. For this graph, in Africa, when it comes to soil usage, there are many technological solutions. This is the first bar here. In order to take care of those emissions, and the two first ones are interesting because for E and M, this has been done through models or economical analysis. These are the solutions that are under $100 in order to clear a ton of CO2 equivalent.
décarbonation, puisque
When it comes to decarbonization, because let me remind you that Group 3 takes care of
il y a aussi,
greenhouse gases
une
emissions
perspective
reductions,
importante qui est en train de se mettre en place.
there is also something
Un
emerging.
taux d'urbanisation qui est en train d'exploser
The
et qui risque
urbanization rate
d'amplifier, en
is
fait,
increasing,
le problème des émissions
which
liées
might
à ces usages des sols.
worsen the
Et,
issues
en finale,
around
le
land
GIEC
use,
évalue
soil
également
use.
le
The
niveau de
IPCC
financement
also
pour
assesses
mettre en place
the
ces
fundings
différentes
required to
solutions
implement
Et,
those
nous
potential
reviendrons dans
solutions.
la discussion de cet
And
après-midi sur
this
cet
afternoon,
aspect.
we'll come back to this
Mais,
issue.
ce financement est évalué à des milliards de
But
dollars avec
This
différents
represents several billion dollars
avec
with different funds,
high confidence,
with a high confidence. We know we need to accelerate international fundings, and that those flows must be extended in order to try and stop this growth of greenhouse gases emissions. So, as I said, this is a cold presentation, a quantified one with figures that doesn't tell us much about what's behind this reality. And today, what we want to do is have a reflection on what could happen in terms of transition in the continent. And as we like to say it in our institute, we need the transition to be holistic and systemic so that issues are not transferred from one another. And there's a lot of things behind transition, but we are drawing inspiration from works from a historian, Geneviève Massart-Guibault, a very interesting work, as she collected all the historical analysis on what transition means. And all the controversies around transitions. And she started by saying that when you think about a transition, we only look at the great transition that happened in the West. So that's the first bias.
Les analyses liées à ce retour historique vont conduire à des discussions autour
And this analysis leads to discussions on the status of the new mineral economy that appeared during the Industrial Revolution. Some think it was necessary to get out of poverty. This is more of a Wrigley. Others, like Malm, consider that it was necessary to support the capitalist economy. Other historians also debate the transition, on the nature of the transition, and whether it existed or not. Most specifically, Jean-Baptiste Fressos, who considers that up until now there never has been a transition, more specifically an energy transition, but rather a sum of new energy channels.
Alors, Geneviève Massart-Guibault
also highlighted that in the analysis, the situation is never presented in the way it appeared or without an explanation of what it is due to. So it's difficult to talk about causes, modalities, and the stakeholders. She also said that it is necessary to have more explanation on other transitions in other regions in order to better understand this complex process that we're trying to explain.
Maintenant parcourir et vous donner quelques exemples en fait.
I'm now going to give you a few examples of what could be done in order to analyze those other transitions in other regions by presenting the history of the Industrial Revolution, but not from the perspective of the countries who created it, but rather from the countries who suffered the consequences.
Et de son exploitation quand il a été exploité si
more specifically with the use of coal by England.
Cette révolution industrielle, elle s'est faite grâce à ce développement.
We tend to think that the Industrial Revolution was due to new mechanical engines and that the surrounding countries who owned resources were supposed to fuel those countries who produce coal with their primary resources. But when you look at the details, you can see that there was a strong policy to extend coal production and coal exports. And when you look at the Mediterranean region and the Ottoman Empire, there was a conjunction of factors where the original fuel was animals. They were decimated due to disease and wars, and coal became particularly useful in order to be used as ballistics in the ships sent by the UK to travel to those countries.
Qu'ils ont utilisé et dont ils sont devenus captifs en quelque sorte avec
So this was used with ballast purposes by the ships, and this was a conjunction of those factors, the need to import. I won't give details about other factors, but Turkey, for example, needed substitutes such as olive pulp or cotton seeds. I see that I have 5 minutes left, but I'm going to ask for an additional 10 minutes.
Donc, l'autre exemple sur lequel je voulais revenir rapidement, en termes
Second example.
C'est le cas donc, du Cameroun avec le déploiement de l'hydroélectricité versus
the rollout of hydroelectricity vs thermal energy. And this is quite interesting because when you look at developed countries, the rationale is completely different from this specific case. In this case, the colonizers, original colonizers, were Germans. Then there was a French and English mandate, and they needed a different type of energy.
S'imposer quelque part par rapport aux enjeux qu'on connaît aujourd'hui. Elle a été plutôt déployée dans les campagnes.
This started in the countryside when the thermal usage was here to support production centers around the cities, and the electric grid started developing from those cities, which led to a struggle because due to maintenance issues, hydroelectricity was no longer sufficient, and they moved to productions based on diesel generators. And there was a switch from 2 to 26% of electrical production through thermal usage. This picture is a recent inauguration of a dam with the launch of a first turbine, but there are still great potentials of hydroelectricity because at the moment it's only at 3% of its potential. And from energy, I'd like to switch to the issue of the environment.
La perception environnementale de l'Afrique n'a pas été non plus neutre.
The environmental perception of Africa was not neutral in the organization of the system, and I'm going to use the example from a very remarkable book about Mrs. Davis' work on the environmental myths of the French colonization in the Maghreb region. In this book, she explained and documented the collective imagination and the popularity of a vision according to which the invasion of the Arabs, when those regions had a very dense forest, well, this invasion led to desertification and deforestation. In the book, she shows that the forest described by the colonizers never existed, and it was not due to fires or extreme cattle breeding that emptied the landscape, but that actions were implemented with the use of funds from the World Bank in order to reduce the number of cattle from 10 million to 3 million, and in order to question a lifestyle of the nomadic people, in order to control those populations. They went from 60% of the population to 5% in 1955, with the creation of a green dam, which was not efficient at all, but that met this urgency due to the desert increase.
Donc en fait, dans ces petits exemples, c'est pour moi l'occasion de dire que pour la compréhension,
through these examples, I'm trying to say that in order to understand the region, you need a context-related analysis.
Tout un mouvement et tout un courant de pensée qui remet de plus en plus.
And this shows a current trend to question current modern societies and their development models, and offering a return to what we call the unappropriable model.
Expériences africaines.
We can learn a lot from the African experience, and this concept of inappropriable was born in regions where the populations go through struggles in arid regions, for example, southern Sahara. There is an interest to access this knowledge, but the difficulty is that it's not easy to access with science that relates to our Western approach. And the documents are hard to find. It's an oral tradition that may have disappeared, unfortunately. I will briefly conclude now by talking about the type of inspiration we could draw from many examples. I personally know the Maghreb region better, so I decided to focus on this region. You probably know those very sophisticated irrigation systems These are hydro networks based on plateaus, reaching a calm with a very interesting design, simply because it's a way to disperse the water on a needs-based approach. This water management system really refers to the discussions we've had in France over the past 2 summers after extreme tensions on water resources.
Sur cette classification finalement de ce qui est utile et de ce qui ne l'est pas.
When we started considering what's useful and what's not, regardless of an economical perspective. Here are two other examples. I wanted to talk about repair cafes in Maghreb and in Africa in general. There's a lot of stores like the one you can see in the picture from Sétif in Algeria. It's a household appliance store where everything is reused. And I really believe this is a lesson for us on the issue of repairability and sustainability. This is a very serious store. It's not just a side store, and they can be found everywhere. And it's part of the culture. Using and repairing. Here's another example that struck me in Morocco. That is the installation of combined biomass, local biomass, and solar energy to fuel the hammams. As a conclusion, I would like to read an extract from François-Xavier Fauvel, a historian who gave a lot of lectures at the Collège de France in this book called Thinking the African History. He says, all the great innovations, including writing, have taken place in Africa. But it's interesting to note that none of these innovations wiped the slate clean, unlike in Eurasia. As in the case of Neolithicization, which left no hunter-gatherer societies. In Africa, on the contrary, technical and economic innovations have coexisted. Farmers with hunter-gatherers, centralized states with nomadic herders. They have not homogenized societies, but rather made their interactions more complex. As a result, the history of Africa is rich not only for what it teaches us about African trajectories, but also because it enables us to reinterrogate the historical trajectory of European societies, which very often wrongly provides the evolutionary model from which to think about the trajectories of other societies in the world. I will let that sink in. Thank you so much.
Merci beaucoup, Nadia.
Thank you, Nadia.